Some love stories begin with a kiss. Some begin with a promise. But this one began with a letter that was never meant to be opened. And yet, that single letter would change the lives of an entire family forever. Part 1. The Old House on Maple Street. In a quiet town in Vermont, there stood an old wooden house on Maple Street. The house had white paint peeling from its walls and a porch that creaked every time someone stepped on it. Inside that house lived Margaret Collins, a 78-year-old widow. Margaret had lived there for almost 50 years. Every morning she sat in her rocking chair near the window, watching the world move while her own life slowly stood still. Her husband, Daniel Collins, had passed away 12 years earlier, but Margaret still kept his coffee mug on the kitchen shelf. She never moved it. She never touched it. Some things were too sacred to disturb. The house was filled with memories. Their wedding photo still hung above the fireplace. The garden outside was still full of roses Daniel had planted decades ago. But what Margaret missed most was the sound of laughter, because the house used to be full of it, especially when their son Michael was little. Part 2. The Son Who Left. Michael Collins had left home when he was 22, not because he didn't love his parents, but because life had pushed him in a different direction. Michael was ambitious. He wanted success. He wanted money. He wanted the kind of life that small towns couldn't give. So he moved to New York City. At first, he called every week, then every month. Then the calls slowly stopped. Life became busy. Career, meetings, deadlines. Michael eventually married a woman named Emily Parker. Emily was kind, intelligent, and patient. They later had a daughter named Sophie. Sophie was 10 years old now, but there was one thing Sophie had never experienced. She had never met her grandmother. Because somewhere between ambition and success, Michael had forgotten the road back home. Part 3. The Day Everything Changed. One rainy afternoon in New York, Michael received a phone call. It was from an unfamiliar number. "Hello?" A gentle voice responded. "Hello? Is this Michael Collins?" "Yes." "My name is Mr. Howard, your mother's neighbor in Vermont." Michael felt his chest tighten. "Is everything okay?" There was a short silence. Then the words came slowly. "Your mother, she had a fall yesterday. She's in the hospital." Michael froze. For the first time in years, the busy world around him suddenly felt very small. He drove to Vermont the next morning with Emily and Sophie. The road felt longer than he remembered. Every mile carried a heavy weight of guilt, because he knew something deep down. He should have come back much sooner. Part 4. The Hospital Room. Margaret lay quietly in a hospital bed. Her silver hair rested gently on the pillow. When Michael entered the room, she opened her eyes slowly. For a moment, neither of them spoke. 12 years of distance stood silently between them. Then Margaret smiled softly. "My little boy." Michael's eyes filled with tears. He walked closer and held her hand. "I'm sorry, Mom." Margaret shook her head gently. "You came. That's enough." But what happened next would change everything. Sophie stepped forward shyly. "Hi, Grandma." Margaret's eyes widened. She looked at the little girl standing beside Michael. Tears rolled down her cheeks. "You must be Sophie." Sophie nodded. Margaret held her hand gently. "I've waited a long time to meet you." Part 5. The Box in the Attic. A few days later, Michael visited the old house on Maple Street. It looked exactly the same. The porch still creaked, the roses still bloomed in the garden, but something felt different. It felt quieter. While cleaning the attic, Michael discovered a small wooden box. Inside were dozens of letters, all addressed to him. Each envelope had a date. The earliest one was written 12 years ago. Michael opened the first letter slowly. Inside was his mother's handwriting. "Dear Michael, I know you're busy building your dreams. Your father would be proud of you. I just wanted you to know the garden bloomed today. The roses you planted when you were 10 finally grew taller than me. I wish you were here to see them. Love, Mom." Michael opened another. "Dear Michael, today was your father's birthday. I baked his favorite apple pie. I saved you a slice just in case you came home." Another letter. "Dear Michael, Sophie must be growing so fast. I imagine she has your smile. Tell her Grandma loves her, even though we haven't met yet." Michael's hands trembled. There were 46 letters. None of them had ever been sent. His mother had written them, but never mailed them. Part 6. The Truth. That evening, Michael sat beside Margaret's hospital bed. He held the box of letters. "Why didn't you send them?" Margaret looked out the window quietly. "Because I didn't want you to feel guilty." Michael's voice cracked. "But Mom, I should have been here." Margaret smiled softly. "Parents don't measure love by visits, Michael. We measure it by hope." She paused. "And I always hoped you'd come home someday." Michael couldn't speak. All the success in the world suddenly felt meaningless. Part 7. Sophie's Idea. The next morning, Sophie had an idea. "Dad, what if we read Grandma's letters online?" Michael looked confused. "What do you mean?" Sophie smiled. "We can share them as stories. People love real stories." Emily nodded. "That's actually beautiful." So they created a small storytelling channel. They called it Letters from Maple Street. Every week, Sophie read one letter from her grandmother. The stories were simple, but they were full of love. And slowly, people around the world started listening. Part 8. The story goes viral. One evening, Sophie read a letter about loneliness. Within days, the video reached millions of views. People commented things like, "I called my mom after hearing this. I'm visiting my parents this weekend. This story made me cry." Margaret watched the video from her hospital bed. Her words were now touching millions of families. She whispered softly, "I never thought my letters would travel this far." Part 9. Coming Home. A few weeks later, Margaret was finally discharged from the hospital. But this time, she didn't return to an empty house. Michael made a decision. He sold his apartment in New York and moved his family back to Vermont. The old house on Maple Street slowly came back to life. The porch echoed with laughter again. Sophie planted new roses in the garden, and Michael fixed the fence his father once built. For the first time in years, the Collins family was whole again. Part 10. The Final Letter. One autumn evening, Margaret handed Sophie a final envelope. "This one is for you." Sophie opened it carefully. Inside was the last letter Margaret had ever written. Dear Sophie, love is not measured by how far we travel. It's measured by how often we return home. Take care of your family and never let silence grow where love should live. Love, Grandma. Sophie hugged her tightly, and for the first time in decades, the house on Maple Street felt exactly the way it was meant to feel, like home. Sometimes the greatest love stories aren't about romance. They're about family, about forgiveness, about finding your way back, even after years of distance. And sometimes all it takes to bring a family together is a letter that finally gets read.